Hey, how's it going? So we are going to get through these Liquid Barn flavors. Today we are going to go over some of their candy flavors. I have their chocolate roll, their sour gummy, their vanilla mint, and their white chocolate peppermint. So, disclaimer time again. I didn't pay for these. Thank you to Liquid Barn for sending them to me. But we'll start off with their chocolate roll. So, shout out to Liquid Barn. They knew their chocolate was going to taste like a Tootsie Roll, and they just went with it. This is definitely a Tootsie Roll flavor. The chocolate here, very familiar from that kind of like TPA double chocolate clear, that sort of not really rich and creamy, kind of powdery, chalky kind of chocolate. Again, the Tootsie Roll thing where you don't really have any of the richness backing it up. It's just kind of like a cocoa powder flavoring and a taffy base. This does that pretty well. I do feel like this is maybe just a little bit darker than your usual like Tootsie Roll. Like it feels like the cocoa they were using is just a little bit darker. It's not like super noticeable or enough to drag it off the straight Tootsie Roll profile. But it definitely seems just a little bit richer than like a straight up Tootsie Roll. The texture here also does a lot of what a Tootsie Roll does. So for that kind of taffy base, you have something that's relatively heavy and kind of waxy. Really does sort of fit into that Tootsie Roll kind of profile. So instead of trying to hide it, they just went with it. Overall, very solid Tootsie Roll kind of flavor. I do get one pretty noticeable off note though. This feels a little bit boozy to me. It feels a little bit like a mouthful of Tootsie Rolls with like a vodka chaser. Like there's something a little bit like grain alcoholish on the back end. It doesn't absolutely kill the flavor for me, but it's a little bit much. Liquid Barn suggests mixing this at 9%. And I do feel like that's kind of overkill. Up at that 9%, mostly what you're getting is a whole lot of wax and some of that booziness. I think if you dial it back to like maybe 3-4%, you're going to have a little bit better time with this. I feel like at that kind of accent percentage, it misses a lot of that really, really obnoxious waxiness and that boozy note. And it just kind of turns into something that's a lot like TPA's double chocolate clear, which use for this pretty much going to be in line with TPA's double chocolate clear. Same basic vibe. You could try to make it into a full-on chocolate with some creams and some AP and stuff. I don't know. I haven't ever had all that much success with it. But hey, if you want a vape that tastes almost exactly like a Tootsie Roll, this is a good bet. Next, I have their Sour Gummy. This is one of Liquid Barn's newer flavors. Supposed to be some sort of sour gummy candy. I'm not necessarily getting that, but at the same time, I think part of it's just some of the inherent sort of limitations of vaping right now. So in terms of the actual like fruit that or candy base, it's being gummy-ized. I do get like a little bit of a softer apple kind of flavor, but there is a pretty strong like red taste to it. Kind of like Swedish Fish, but not as like saturated as you'd expect there. It's just that kind of generic candy red, could be cherry, could be raspberry. And sort of along with that, you get some of those harsher sort of benzene or plastic off notes. I don't quite get the right kind of sour out of this, but I don't think that's entirely Liquid Barn's fault. I think the sour that they are using is like your more traditional like citric or malic acid sour that you see in vaping a whole lot. And it never really clicks for me like an actual sour like you get from a candy. While you do get like kind of a tartness to it, it doesn't really have that kind of like puckery sour thing going on. And then those kind of citric and malic acids over time, to me, it feels like they kind of hollow out a vape, if that makes any sense. It takes away a lot of the sort of richness right in the middle of the flavor, and it makes everything feel a little bit thin and watery. And I think that could be where I'm getting the apple, on the actual like fruit flavor here. It's kind of a thinner, watery apple. It kind of makes sense with what the actual malic acid would be doing here. The mouthfeel for a gummy, again, isn't quite working for me, but I'd be willing to chalk some of that up to the sour. What I do get is I get a very heavy kind of waxy mouthfeel. So, like the difference between Swedish Fish and like normal gummy bears. Swedish Fish have that kind of like waxier texture. I'm getting a lot of that like all on my lips, all up in my mouth. all that other stuff. So I feel like they've nailed kind of the waxy part of a gummy, but they haven't really got that sort of denseness and chewiness there. And again, I think that might just be the malic acid basically eating the flavor out from underneath it. This did steep for quite a while, so I mean that could be part of it. With sour flavors generally you don't want to steep that long, so you're probably looking at a shorter steep with this one. Where I run into issues with a shorter steep though is that kind of candy red flavor is pretty obnoxious fresh. Especially at higher percentages. I get a whole lot of plastic off that. Yeah, tastes kind of plasticky fresh, and then as it steeps out, it gets a little bit thin. Maybe even starts to taste a little bit metallic, and again, I think that's probably due to the malic acid here. Liquid Barn suggests mixing this all the way up at 17%, and I have to say, I do not really agree. It's intense up there, it's almost like that sour has like an actual like tactile bite to it, which is a little bit unpleasant. And then I get like a whole heaping of just that red fruit candy plastic off note kind of stuff. I'd kind of be using this more in an accent roll, sort of at a lower percentage, maybe like 4 or 5%, with some profiles that can really handle it. I think you could go ahead and use this on top of some FA Blackcurrant, just because it has that really kind of intense gumminess. You might be able to fight back some of that like malic acid thinness there. I think it'd also go fairly well with like TPA's Red Licorice or Capella's 27 Fish or 27 Bears. You kind of want to have your candy base in place and then maybe add some of this on top. But it doesn't really click for me as a solo flavor. Next, I have their Vanilla Mint. I just went ahead and lumped this in with their candy flavors because honestly, it kind of reminds me of like an Altoid or some kind of breath mint. So what I do get is something that's very spearmint heavy here. And the spearmint isn't like a natural leafy green spearmint or whatever, but it is one of the more like restrained candy spearmints that I've actually ran across. It's not really like chalky and oversweet like you'd expect from something like a Wrigley's Double Mint Gum kind of flavor. It does feel a lot more like an Altoid. There's a thinner kind of mouthfeel to it, and then the mentholation here is actually fairly intense, which is kind of nice. It's an aggressive spearmint flavor, but the vanilla, I feel, does a little bit to kind of knock the edge off of it. Which is great. That vanilla flavor, it's a very bright kind of commercial vanilla, and it's definitely an accent. It really only shows up at like the back end of the vape. What I find that's doing more than anything else is kind of taking the harsher, almost like spicy edge off the spearmint. I think overall, the way this flavor is built, it's kind of just built to make vaping spearmint pleasant because you have just a little bit of sweetness to it. It's not, again, not overwhelming, not candied, but it is just enough sweetness to kind of take the edge off of it. What you're left with is pretty much a really solid spearmint with just a little bit of a vanilla accent. But I do have to say, I dig it. It's really well balanced. It's really well done. It's a good, like, no-brainer kind of menthol-ish palate cleanser flavor. Liquid Barn suggests mixing this at 15%. Kind of feels like overkill here. That spearmint kind of crosses the line over into almost like spicy and chemical for me up at 15%. I'd probably be down around like 10%, but I do like my mentholation, and this is pretty intensely cool. So if you're going to go up to that kind of percentage, you gotta like it cold. Outside of a solo flavor, you could maybe mix this with some kind of like berries or something. I mean, it's not a bad spearmint flavor for mixing, but I feel like it doesn't have much body on its own, and so it's just kind of sit in the top notes, those kind of fruity mixes. I do think this would be really interesting with tobaccos, though, because it has like a very sort of commercial sweet menthol flavor. So if you could come up with like a cigarette base or something like this, I think this would be a really interesting additive to kind of bring the menthol to your menthol cigarettes. Overall, this is great, though. Good mix for turning your brain off. I mean, it's not rocket science, really. It's vanilla and it's mint, but I really like the way this is balanced. I like the more intense mentholation. It's a really solid mix for just kind of turning your brain off and chilling on, which is awesome. Last for today, I have their white chocolate peppermint. So out of all the flavors that we're covering today, this one definitely has the most traction. You'll see it used in the most recipes out of these. For good reason, too. It's pretty solid. So it's supposed to be some kind of peppermint bark flavor. You know, you got white chocolate, you got peppermint. It mostly reads like that to me, but I feel like it's a little bit thin in the middle, and so it kind of feels a little bit more like a espresso syrup. You know, like all the flavors there, just the texture is just a hair off. Um, this definitely leads with the peppermint, though. It's not like crazy mentholated. It's certainly not as mentholated as the vanilla mint, but there is some pretty distinct coolness there. It's a very sweet peppermint flavor, kind of like a candy cane or like a Starlight mint, that kind of vibe. But it doesn't really have the body behind it, you know? So you mostly get like a sweet cooling sensation, which is really pleasant, but it doesn't really have like the candy base to back that up. The white chocolate here is very solid. It has some like kind of heavier waxy notes to it. Feels like maybe a little bit dry and crumbly. It kind of reminds me more of something along the lines of like Hershey's white chocolate instead of like some super premium ultra creamy white chocolate. But you know, it basically gets the job done. It isn't quite as rich as something like Flavor West's white chocolate. But on the bright side, I can taste this and not just get a mouthful of black pepper like I do with TPA's white chocolate. So, I mean, that's something to watch out for if you don't think you like white chocolate. This doesn't have that kind of heavy peppery taste to it. I am just getting like a little bit of a weird texture, you know. It does have that heavier white chocolate base and it has plenty of peppermint in the top notes, but the middle just doesn't really come together for me. It feels like it needs something to fill it out a little bit in the middle. In terms of where you're going to use this, again, this actually has some traction, and I think a lot of people have already explored like the uses for this, because you're going to need a profile where both white chocolate and peppermint are going to be useful. You're not going to be able to get rid of either one of those. So we're looking at like ice creams, coffees. I know Fear has like a chocolate chip peppermint cookie recipe out, which the bakery thinks a pretty good way to play that. But overall, I mean, you're basically looking at seasonal stuff, but it's also a really solid solo flavor too. Liquid Barn suggests mixing with this at 12%, which seems like a little bit of overkill for me, honestly. That peppermint gets a little bit too cool. It almost gets a little bit astringent. For a solo mix, I like it more around like 8%. So shout out to other people's notes, because they were talking about, well, the white chocolate doesn't really come out until like 7%. And I tried it out. Turns out they were dead on. So shout out to other people for telling me what's going on here. But that's kind of why I keep it at that 8%. So you get both the white chocolate and the peppermint. I do think this is going to work fairly well in more of an accent roll, though. That peppermint's going to come through at like 3-4%, and you'll still get enough of a white chocolate to kind of hang other chocolates off. I feel like you'll be able to go ahead and sort of pick that white chocolate back up, even at an accent percentage, if you have any other kind of chocolate or cream in the mix. So yeah, overall, this caught hype, pretty well deserved. So yeah, Liquid Barn candy flavors. This was a really interesting batch of flavors to test. The white chocolate peppermint, very good, very seasonal. One of the best like seasonal dependent concentrates that I've had. So, you know, Christmas is coming up. Why not get you some? I really like the vanilla mint. I'm not sure it's, you know, particularly breathtaking or complex, but it's a really solid, really refreshing vanilla mint mix. Sour Gummy Worm didn't really do it for me, but, you know, that's cool. It's a really ambitious profile. I'm not surprised, but at the same time, it would have been nice if they'd been the ones to finally crack the code on that in DIY juice. And the chocolate roll tastes like Tootsie Rolls. So if you're into Tootsie Rolls, go ahead and pick that one up. So if you're looking at any of these, I hope that was helpful. Thank you very much for watching. I do really appreciate it. I'll catch you later.